Hey, podcast listeners, it's Ria Wong with you once again with Nonprofit Lowdown. Today, I am speaking with two dear friends about East Coast versus West Coast fundraising. I think there's some big differences, and we are going to find out what they are. So please welcome my guests, Michael Royston. He is VP at Lyric Center for LGBTQ plus youth in San Francisco, and Marvin Vilma, who is the Managing Director of Development at Let's Get Ready in Boston. I know both of you have been podcast guests before, so welcome back.
Awesome. Thanks for having us.
Great to be back, Ria.
Always great to have you. Okay, Michael, let's start with you. Can you give us a brief tour of your career in nonprofit and how you ended up fundraising? And then Marvin, will go to you.
Yeah, for sure. I went to school in DC, so East Coast originally, and was working at the YMCA in DC and started fundraising while I was in college. And that was kind of how I started it. Then I went abroad for about 7.5 years and worked in international development, but fundraising for about 22 countries, mostly in the Asian region. And then I always tell people that true love is giving up your penthouse apartment in Bangkok and moving to San Francisco. And so my partner's 8th-generation San Franciscan. So there's no way I was going to get him to leave. And so moved to San Francisco and started raising money for international efforts here. But now I work for the second oldest and second largest LGBTQ youth center in the United States. But I also do some side projects still in Asia. I just got back from Vietnam last week, where I was helping a bunch of queer activists and asylum seekers, kind of like raising money for their activism and their art. So still raising money both on the East Coast, West Coast, and internationally.
Oh, that's so interesting. We might also get into international fundraising if that's different at all. Marvin, over to you.
Thanks, Ria. So my journey to fundraising, I think, started in my youth because I was the beneficiary of a lot of support from various nonprofit organizations. So felt familiar with philanthropy and fundraising as a beneficiary, but I think really started to dip my toes into the work after working with Ria as a teaching fellow at Breakthrough New York and having the opportunity to visit a donor at their home on Long Island and be a part of this event experience where I got to see fundraising happen close up and felt like it was a career pathway that intrigued me enough to the point where I did an internship in college in the special events department, and that materialized into my current career. I will say that my journey into frontline fundraising specifically was a little bit more circuitous than what I just described, because for the longest time, I thought special events was my way to contribute to fundraising, my way to contribute to the nonprofit ecosystem. But I learned through a lot of trial and error and through a lot of mentorship that any nonprofit executive needs to know how to do frontline fundraising. So in an effort to get that box checked off, I decided to pursue frontline fundraising in a higher education institution, worked at a graduate school, and learned really sort of the process of cultivating a donor, stewarding a donor, and going through that donor engagement process. Fell in love with it, and here I am today doing it at a smaller organization that does college access work. And I'm really glad to be here to talk about some of what I've learned on this journey.
Awesome. And, I must say, I am so privileged to have been part of your journey, Marvin. I feel like the world has a talented fundraiser because I invited you to that fundraiser. So just so we can ground ourselves a little bit, let's start with you, Marvin. Can you tell us who you're primarily raising money from when you're talking about your frontline fundraising? Are you primarily dealing with foundations, corporations, individuals, or something else?
In my current role with Let's Get Ready, I am working with a combination of all of the above, primarily foundations that are providing larger checks to our organization. And I also work with individuals who have either a family foundation or they're giving through a donor advised fund. I will say that in terms of my specific market, it is an older group of individuals, many of whom are either retired or close to retirement. It is a predominantly white community that I work with, and they're very New York City based. And so it's interesting, living in Boston, but working with a donor community in New York. There are certainly even some differences that I've noticed being on the East Coast between my Boston donors and my New York City donors. And we can dive more into that as the conversation moves forward. But that's my primary market that I support.
Oh, can't wait to dig into it. And Michael, over to you. I know that you have taken on a lot of other responsibilities, but when you were primarily doing frontline fundraising, who was the target audience?
Yeah, so I'm a lot like Marvin. I kind of have a mix of all three. I would say that particularly foundations, we receive a lot of our financial support from foundations, but because we're an LGBTQ center, we also get a lot of corporations that are interested in us, particularly around June, not so surprisingly, when we suddenly become relevant. And so we do a lot of ERG work with corporations in June. And then those corporations, like some of them are East Coast based, but there's also a lot of tech companies that are West Coast based. And then our foundations, we have a lot of foundations, family foundations, et cetera, that are based here in Northern California. But we also have several. One foundation in particular that supports us is actually based in Boston. So it's kind of interesting, just kind of the differences there. But yeah, then we also, a lot of individuals, and a lot of our individual donors are older gay men, actually. And a lot of them live in Northern California, but over time, a lot of them have also started moving out to the desert and to Palm Springs. And so it's interesting just even how, like, to Marvin's point, like the differences of even what I noticed when my donors are like, have relocated to Southern California, like there's a bit of a difference of just how they engage, like even though they were in Northern California, but then suddenly, I don't know what, I guess once you hit the desert life, like it just changes completely. So
Fundraiser in Palm Springs. I love it. Okay, wait. So let's just dig into it. And for the purposes of this conversation, let's really focus on individuals, because I think that's where I think we're going to see the most difference. So Adam, Michael, let's start with you. What differences have you noticed with your donor? Because actually, and maybe this is wrong, but I would have assumed that your donor base would be a bit younger, just given the amount of wealth in the tech community. But what have you noticed with your donor base as far as the process of bringing them through the donor journey?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that a lot of my individuals, I do have younger as well. I would say that there was a mid-range point probably of like that first kind of tech boom of folks. And so I would say, a lot of my donors, like they do not want to necessarily meet in person. They want to get fast information as quickly as possible. I text a lot with my donors, which I think is like very different than my East Coast donors. Like it's always emails, it's always even, like hard mail, I think is a great example. So our East Coast donor, or just we just had an event last night, and we had some folks that we invited that were not based in San Francisco, and we were very clear that they needed to get like handwritten hard copy invitations. Whereas like a lot of our donors who came, we actually got them there via an image that we got up and texted. So we mass texted a lot of our donors to get them to the event last night. And I would say more of those came than not. And I don't think that that's something that people would necessarily engage with like in other places, but it was very like supportive of our community here. So that's like definitely one thing that we do is try to use tech as much as possible. But also just like, I feel like our donors, like, because it's San Francisco, they're so used to just getting like impact numbers and impact data. And so one of the things last night that like we knew we had to have was kind of like an impact sheet or a data sheet that had like numbers, right? Because like so many folks in our community are data driven and are so used to analyzing data all day. So if you don't have those things, like the feel good stories just are not what they're looking for as much as like the impact.
Oh, that's so interesting. And actually, I just want to put a pin in this. I'd love for you to tell the story that you told me about how luxury brands train their salespeople in San Francisco, because I think that's like a whole other thing. But Marvin, over to you. What does your cycle look like? Is it much more traditional? Is it a little bit more buttoned up?
Yeah, it certainly feels more traditional and buttoned up, and I'm really sort of curious to learn more about your experience, Adam Michael, um, particularly in sort of San Francisco, Silicon Valley. But for the purposes of our conversation today, I'm going to primarily talk about New York City because I think when looking at East Coast and West Coast, people oftentimes compare California and New York, although there are lots of local geographies on the East Coast and the West Coast that we can also explore. But I think California and New York are pretty representative of sort of what we hope to get from this conversation. So in New York City, a lot of folks get their wealth from being in financial services. And so that lends itself to a little bit more of a polished traditional culture. And I think that's best represented in the types of events that we host for individual donors. It's a lot of sit down, cold chicken type of galas that are very sort of fundamental to people's philanthropic experience in New York City. There's a lot of storytelling that happens via email and handwritten notes, and people are really focused on proximity to the mission. They want to hear a story, they want to see a student, they want to feel close to the mission by like really understanding what is the community challenge or problem being solved, and they want to feel like they are part of that. So I don't text my donors, but I do a lot of phone calls, I do a lot of emailing and handwritten notes, and it's that personal touch that really helps to convey you put in energy towards this relationship and I want to see you sort of work for it. And maybe this is a little bit of me internalizing things as a fundraiser, but I've always felt that impression from working with donors. You know, they want to see effort, they want to be taken out to lunch to really have a conversation about what their gift is contributing towards. And so maybe that's a little bit of a distinction from the California engagements that Anna Michael spoke about.
Well, and follow-up question.
I had a question actually.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I haven't when you said that about using the like calling, I'm like, whoa, like I haven't called a donor in so long, and that this makes me probably sound so horrible as a fundraiser, but I like when I call, what I've noticed is like people will just text me back and be like, hey, what's up? And it's like so when you said that, I was like, oh gosh, I haven't called in so long. So it was funny like that you brought that up, because do people answer the phone?
Yeah, people answer the phone and they are very proactive at calling me. In fact, you know, if they have a question or they just received an email and they're like, oh, that was a really cool piece of content, let me call Marvin because of course he's going to answer. So it is a very different dynamic than texting. There's this expectation that you are available for a conversation always.
So my question is, how much do you think of this is generational and how much do you think is geographically specific? And maybe there's no like right answer, but it's an interesting question.
I think it's like a mix, right? I mean, I think it has to be like, you kind of have to view it as both, but then I think you also have to think about like when you're thinking about wealth, like there is geographic wealth that's generational, right? So I think when you think about like New York City, you think about like certain philanthropic families that have always kind of been involved. And then, you know, traditionally there's a lot of more like newer wealth in Silicon Valley and San Francisco. And I feel like it's more like there's this idea that like anyone could be really like able to like make those kind of impact gifts in this area. And it's not like the traditional families. Like we do have those traditional families, but I actually find that like they are less and less of a conversation, like because there is so much other wealth that is happening. But yeah, I kind of feel like it's both, but it's still regional in the sense of like where the wealth came from. So I think that's where the culture of the differences come from.
Oh, that's such an interesting point. Yeah, I was just thinking about like, boomer versus Gen X versus Gen Z versus millennial. But Adam, Michael, that's such a good point about the sources of wealth, right? Because it's really different. Marvin, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I would just sort of double click what Adam Michael shared. I think there are overlaps, and we all have intersectional identities. So it certainly isn't sort of this binary of East Coast and West Coast. There are other factors that inform the way folks think about their philanthropy. But I think the source of wealth is a big one. And also, what are the industries in these different areas that inform how people think about their philanthropy? In New York, it's a lot of finance, it's media, it's publishing. I'm going to make an assumption here, Adam Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would assume that entertainment, tech is really big on the West Coast where you are. And so that certainly shapes people's approach. And the other thing that I'll add quickly is I actually think it's the bigger nonprofits that also influence how people think about philanthropy on both coasts. In Boston and New York, there is a very strong hospital and higher education ecosystem. And so if you go to a Harvard, MIT, NYU, Columbia, or if you are interacting with any of the hospitals, they are training people to think about philanthropy in a specific type of way and really setting the tone for the type of philanthropy people engage with. And so I think a lot about where do people get their wealth from, what type of nonprofits are setting the tone for the ecosystem, and also like how nonprofit rich are those different communities? Like, are there a ton of nonprofits or are there not? And that also sort of shapes the conversation.
Such a good point. Um, it reminds me, someone once said this to me, and I thought it was so interesting that every different city kind of has a way to show status. So in New York, it's money. In DC, it's power. In San Francisco, it's kind of spirituality and like connectedness. So
Yeah.
good segue here. Adam, Michael, I'd love for you to tell the story that you told me that kind of just blew my mind about how luxury salespeople are trained in San Francisco.
Yeah, for sure. So I have a friend who works for a really nice luxury brand. I also personally, if you know me, love luxury brands and love to go
You
shopping.
so fancy, Adam Michael.
You
Anyway,
always
please
say
continue.
that. But so when you go to become a sales agent at a lot of these luxury brands, you go through kind of their boot camp, if you will, of like how do you pick out a potential client and like what are you looking for in terms of how they're dressed and how like how they come into the store and etc. And so this one particular brand has this like 3-day kind of thing where they go through all this. And then if you're based in Northern California, so if you're at there's a store in Stanford and in Palo Alto, and there's a store in San Francisco. And if you're at either one of those, then you have to go to an additional day where they basically tell you forget everything that you just learned. And then here's actually what you're looking for. And it's like, the person in the sweatpants and the hoodie, like actually those sweatpants and hoodies could be like $1,000 and like those are actually your clients. It's like the ones that go into the store that like aren't really like blingy and showy. Like those are the ones that are probably actually going to be the ones that are going to drop more money inside the store, because San Francisco just has like such a different, like Northern California has like such a different culture in terms of like how we present ourselves like with luxury goods. And so I think that really relates back to like fundraising too, right? Like when you're thinking about looking for folks and you're mining and prospect developing, like I think that oftentimes if you go like the traditional route in Northern California, like you could be missing some really key folks, right? Like I have a neighbor, for instance, who worked at a major tech company. They have 2 kids. I have an 11-year-old, so they have 2 kids roughly on either side of my kid. And she's 42 and retired and has no intentions of ever working again. And so like when she like told us like 2 or 3 weeks ago, they came over for a glass of wine, and then I was asking her how work was going. She's like, "Oh, I'm retiring." And I thought she was joking. I truly didn't believe it. And I was like, "What are you gonna do?" She's like, "I don't know. Like, I guess maybe like become a philanthropist. Like, isn't that what people do once they retire?" And I was like, you're 40, like you're in your mid 40s, like how are you retiring? And she's like, because I just don't want to work anymore and I don't have to. And so, I think that's a great example because I know that they are like significant contributors to a diabetes organization in the area because their daughter has diabetes. And I think traditional like fundraisers would have totally not picked up on either one of them because they wouldn't fit the normal profile of someone who would give, but they give significantly in the community.
That is so funny. And Adam, Michael, you've just talked about my life ambition. I want to be work optional is actually where I'm headed.
Work adjacent.
Work adjacent. That's right. I like it, but I don't want to be like super involved with it. I'm going to be a philanthropist is actually what I'm trying to say. Okay, let's talk nitty gritty. How long is your cultivation cycle on average? Marvin, let's start with you.
And we're talking about for a major gift.
Yeah, major gift.
I would say the range is from 6 to 9 months, and I would say that it also depends on what type of shop you're working in. To be clear, if you're working in higher education, it can be 6 to 9 months to a year. For smaller organizations like Let's Get Ready, I think there's a shorter window of time, 6 to 9 months, but it takes a while. And it takes a while because people are very purposeful and intentional in how they think about their philanthropy. So there's a lot of work that goes into making sure there's alignment and that it feels right and the relationship is in a place where you can sort of like negotiate a gift that makes sense with their intentions and with what the organization has to offer.
So 6 to 9 months on average. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Adam, Michael?
Yeah, I would say like 0 months to like 3 months. Like
What is 0 months?
Literally people just finding you and giving you money that you didn't even have in your like pipeline. Like I think like, and I have other fundraising friends who say like this happens a lot. And in particular, like it's changing a little bit a lot because of the tech layoffs that are occurring. And so we are seeing an impact of that. But at the same time, like I always am telling people like, tech is laying off because they overhired, but there's still a significant amount of people who are still working and those like higher level positions aren't going anywhere. And so what we find is like when bonuses happen, like we get a significant amount of money. So like when tech companies go through their bonus structure or law firms do their bonuses for the year, we see that. And so I have a major donor who truly came to us in May. I had never asked them, and they gave me a pretty significant gift for Lyric size. And they were just like, oh, they're both like double income, no kids kind of situation, both techies. And they were like, you do good work, like here's a gift. And I hadn't ever met them. We had no relationship. And I've tried to establish a relationship. We've had coffee once for 25 minutes. And every time either one of them gets a bonus, I get $5,000 now. And so this has happened like in 6 months. That's happened 4 times. And that's on top of their first significant gift, which was much more than $5,000. And so I know that's just like one example, but I truly do have a lot of those examples where, like, for instance, last night at our event, my boss was, traditionally, right, I think you would have an event and you get the photos of your biggest donors and then you like write out like a thing and then everyone knows who everyone is in the room. And like my boss and I have worked together previously at a very large nonprofit who would have gone about doing that way. And at when we were prepping for it, they were like, who are these people? I was like, I think it's them, but like, I'm not sure because like, I've never actually met them. And they were like, but it says they give us $100,000 a year. I'm like, yeah, but we don't know them. Like, and I was like, they just give us money and I was like, and they also might not be here. And I would love to hear Marvin's take on this. So like, we're very like, I think more and more in Northern California, like we're very anti name tag at events. And so like, and it's really interesting because when folks come from other areas, like people are like, oh, there's no name tags. And I'm like, yeah, like, I don't know, we just aren't like very big on that. So I don't know like your take on that, because that's something that shows up sometimes when like there's that cross-cultural pollination that occurs. And because I would guess that you probably do like name tags, and people are like very traditional, like I want to know who I'm talking
yeah,
to.
New Yorkers love a name tag. Marvin, what do you think?
Indeed, we love a name tag. And like you were saying, Adam Michael, there's so much that you can learn about a culture through the types of events that they host. In New York, not only do we love name tags, I think we also like to know who's going to be in the room before we show up, because people like to sort of prepare mentally to have conversations with certain people. And so oftentimes I get the question, who else is showing up to this place? There's not that sort of authentic curiosity of let me just be there and experience the event as it happens. There's a lot of mental preparation that folks like to do. There's a lot of, I think, just like consuming knowledge at events. So people like to sit down and listen to a story or a lecture or something, which is very different than perhaps the West Coast, where people want to talk to each other and sort of have a more informal networking gathering. I don't have any sort of like specific West Coast stories because I've never done West Coast fundraising outside of foundation work. But it's always interesting to look from a university perspective at their staff. And you can pretty much tell who's a West Coast fundraiser versus an East Coast fundraiser. In our office at the university I worked at prior, our West Coast fundraiser would come into the office like with a very different wardrobe than our East Coast fundraisers, who had the pearls and the earrings and like a very polished look. So yeah, it was just fascinating to just see that difference on a day-to-day basis.
You can
When I
also see that if you go to any of the national fundraising conferences, it's like my favorite thing. Like you can see like the complete pollination of like who fundraises where. And it's always like my partner always jokes, it's like, are they fundraisers or real estate agents? Because like they could be either one. And but like when you go, particularly this past year, like the national conference was in Las Vegas, so there was a lot of West Coasters there. And so like you could just see like people, like to your point, like even at conferences, like fundraisers from the East Coast like are like in pantsuits and like suits and ties. And I'm like, oh, I own like 2 suits because like I got rid of them all when I moved back from Bangkok, because I used to have to wear suits every day. And then moving here, I was like, oh, like no one's gonna take me seriously if I have a suit on. Like they're gonna be like, who's this guy? Like, or like
That's so
why
funny.
does he have a suit?
Well, and I also think there's something here too about the difference between first generation wealth creators and people who have inherited wealth. Like I have friends who have made significant wealth in tech, and they call it the internet lottery, and in some ways they don't really see it the same way as someone who has generational wealth might in a stewardship sense. Okay, let's talk about solicitation because I'm so curious. So rule of thumb, best practice is we're taught as fundraisers to do solicitation in person for a significant gift. Curious, especially you, Adam Michael. Is that true for you?
No, I would say like I do a lot of Zoom calls. I don't, and I wouldn't consider that like in person. And if I do things in person, they're short. Like I find them to be a lot shorter than would have been used to. And I think that the pandemic has changed that a lot too. I think that so many folks like sit so much on Zoom, and are so used to it. But yeah, I would say like there's a lot of like solicitation for us comes in a lot of different ways. And I think like we have to think about like how people are using the technology that they use every day. So yeah, and I mean, Maria knows this, that my favorite place is the Four Seasons bar in San Francisco. And like I probably close more deals there than anything, but it's really like that, you know, like that's a space in San Francisco where a lot of tech deals get made too. And so I think like that's a really, like, if fundraisers are thinking about their own context, like think about in terms of business, like where are the deals happening, and then like figure out how you can also get into that space, right? Because even if you're in a small town in the Midwest or in the South, like I'm from North Carolina myself, like there are spaces, right? Like that, like diners or spaces that folks like meet and have those business deals. And so if you're like present yourself in a lot of those spaces, then people just start recognizing you. And then they're like, well, you're here a lot. Like I've met a lot of donors, like just by people being like, oh, you're here a lot. Like, do you live in the building? And I'm like, no, I don't live in the building. Like I like, but like, you know, that like kind of makes people more familiar with you. And so I think like that's a really good rule of thumb. Like there's, you know, everywhere there's spaces that deals get made. And so I would figure out why is it that nonprofit folks like don't feel comfortable like forcing themselves in that space as well.
Yeah, for sure. You gotta fish where they're fish in the pond. Anyway, stupid analogy. But side note, if I were West Coast fundraising, I for sure would be at Burning Man because, like, weirdly, a lot of deals get made at Burning Man.
I know nonprofit people who put that in their budget.
Yeah, they should. Do you know how many people who are like tech rich hang out at Burning Man? It's a
Yeah.
thing. And Kauai, weirdly, Kauai is like a hub. Anyway, Adam, Michael, I think you should put Kauai in your budget.
I'll try that one.
Marvin, over to you. What does what does your solicitation look like? Is it still more tradish?
This is fascinating because this is so foreign to me. It is very traditional relative to what you all just heard. Lots of sit down coffees, lunches, dinners in person, and sometimes if that's folks' homes, so they invite us over for a dinner and we have the opportunity to make the ask. And what I was most fascinated by as you were talking, Adam Michael, is that you used the word deal. And I was like, oh, this is kind of blowing my mind because even the way that we talk about a gift is very different in terms of the nomenclature we use. And so it's very traditional out here on the East Coast. And for some people, it works great, and for others, not. But yeah.
Okay, final question about the process. Marvin, let's talk about stewardship. So once you seal the deal, it sounds like your donors are very into like the touch points, the phone calls, the coffees, and so forth. Is that true? And is that true for all of the different ages of major donors that you have?
Oh, that's a good question. So I'll answer your first question first. I think there is a high level of accountability that major gift donors in particular expect from organizations. Whether it's there's a report that happens or a conversation that's scheduled, 6 months later to sort of hear an update about how their gift is being leveraged. There's a lot of expectations around communication post gift being made, and um, it's interesting because what I've also noticed more recently is that folks like to not make a lump sum gift, but they like to spread out their gift, even if it's within one fiscal year. So maybe half of the gift comes in, quarter two, and then the other half comes in quarter four, because people really want to assess how well am I going to be stewarded before that second gift comes in. And so there is a high level of accountability that is both appreciated, but also just this vestige, I think, of philanthropy of like the early 20th century. And on the younger generation front, I think there's this interesting blend. I think the younger generation folks realize that accountability can be problematic, but they also want to hear from us often. And so I think many of my millennial donors struggle with this tension of wanting to be sort of a more community centric donor and also wanting to um, feel like they're a part of the organization in a deeper way. Um, and so oftentimes I hear conflicting perspectives from them. Does that answer your question, Ria?
Yeah, yeah. What I'm hearing is it depends. And actually, I'm going to ask you a next question about general trends and forecasting. So hold tight to that. But Adam, Michael, I am fascinated by the fact that you have six-figure donors who never want to hear from you. Say more. What does stewardship look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, stewardship, like a lot of times it's like data reports, like data figures or numbers, oftentimes like Instagram, like texting them. Sometimes like we Instagram our donors actually. Like that's one thing we didn't talk about, but like we Instagram message a lot of our donors. And this isn't necessarily just like millennial donors either. Like I have folks in my capital campaign who are in their 70s who like are my friends on Instagram. And that's like for them, like they're following and keeping up, and they'll be, you know, when I have community meetings, they're like, oh, we saw like the fair that happened or like the coat drive and like it looked amazing. And it's like, I didn't put together like a shiny report being like, oh, here's our coat drive and we gave out like 1,000 coats. It's like, I feel like so many folks are engaging with us in that way. So that, yeah, it's a lot of that. I mean, I think like too, like with particularly with foundations and stewardship, like Marvin's point, I have foundations on the East Coast who the reporting requirements like are exhaustive, and like they want to know where every dollar was spent, and like there's 15 reports due in a year. And then most of my foundations that are based in Northern California or on the West Coast in general are like much more trust based. They're like, here's, $100,000, like just give us a one story at the end of the year, right? And so I have several reports due like in the next 3 weeks, and I'm not really stressed out about it because they're mostly just like, tell us some like good things that occurred, right? And these are some fairly large foundations that are based here. And it makes me, when I'm thinking about like looking and mining and prospecting further, it does have, for me, have a tendency to lend itself like more to the foundations that are West Coast based, because when I see some of these sometimes based on the East Coast, I'm like, oh, the reporting requirements are going to be really like stringent, and I'm going to have to like have like a 5 to 15 page report that's due and ask like multiple questions. And so I think it also like kind of impacts like how you're like that stewardship piece kind of impacts like full circle back to prospecting, because in my mind I'm like, oh, that's going to be a lot of work on the back end, and like we have a really small development team at the center. So when we're looking at that, it kind of comes down to that as well. But yeah, I mean, stewardship too, it's a lot of keeping people updated on data numbers is really, really important for us. The stories are great, and we sprinkle in stories here and there. But really what our donors find the most is like, they want to know how many youth were served. They want to know, like, the thing that happens a lot at our center is people are fascinated by our breakdown of orientation and like gender identity, which was something like I didn't expect coming into the job, but people are constantly wanting to know like how many like gay youth we serve versus trans youth. And that's like been a really interesting kind of thing. I think that's like more to do with like the LGBTQ community though. And so they're very interested. And I think particularly in the last like year where 38 states have anti-trans legislation on the books, like that's like been a key data point that folks are really interested in. But I think it's also like, when I'm thinking about the differences, like because I work in a very intersectional area of like LGBTQ community, and then East Coast, West Coast, like we do have foundations that give and individuals that give. And sometimes I'm like, I kind of like code switch, for lack of term, of like what I'm going to talk about, because like I have foundations in anti-trans legislation states. And so I'm like, how do I, and they're not necessarily like LGBTQ funders, right? Like there's only like the LGBTQ funding network, there's an official network, probably only has like 30 foundations that are members. So there's not a ton of like LGBTQ specific foundations out there. So then when I'm talking to family foundations, like, I have one that's based in Texas, and I'm always like, how do I prepare for this conversation, right? Like it's a very different conversation than the conversations I'm having with individuals and family foundations here in Northern California, because it's like we're all like talking to ourselves, and it's like we're preaching to the choir almost. So then when we like bring folks from outside, like it's a different conversation. And so that's a kind of something I deal with in stewardship, is like, what am I sharing? Like, how far am I going? Am I talking about like the different laws that California is enacting to be pro like sanctuary and things like that versus not?
Right.
Because I think that can show up and kind of cause like tension sometimes.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing too is just really, for lack of a better term, segmenting your stewardship and knowing your audience, bottom line. Okay. I'm going to ask a final question for you to be, future casters here. Marvin, what are you seeing as sort of the future of fundraising with your individual donors on the East Coast? What are some trends that you point to?
I'm really excited by the trend of two things come to mind, but I think I may have more to share after Adam Michael responds as well. But the two things that are coming to mind are sort of more of this trust-based community-centric approach to philanthropy. I think it's in part because of the West Coast funders who have made a bigger splash and really sort of reimagine what philanthropy can look like. And so, Mackenzie Scott, and we always think about the Gates effect. People are seeing these highly visible philanthropists think differently about their wealth. And I think that's impacted a lot of younger individual donors who want to take this more trust-based approach and be intentional, but also um, give freely in a way that is unrestricted and really provides nonprofits the opportunity to uh, leverage their funds as they see fit. And so that's exciting to me. And then the second piece that I find exciting is that, I think this forthcoming wealth transfer is really going to open up doors for a lot of organizations. And it's going to force us to really be smart about partnerships, which I think is another thing that people are starting to really think deeply about. Not necessarily mergers and acquisitions, although I do think that is part of this conversation, but people are more and more interested, individuals are more and more interested in how are organizations thinking broadly about systems level change, systematic change, by leveraging the partnerships with other organizations, leveraging corporate partnerships, leveraging partnerships with policy organizations and legislative organizations or communities. And that's exciting to me because I think for too long, particularly on the East Coast, we've taken this very siloed, like, let me fund X organization because they are doing such good work by themselves, which is just not, I think, a productive way to think about philanthropy and the nonprofit ecosystem. But I think younger folks are really thinking about how can we rethink the entire ecosystem and how it works.
That's such a good answer. Thanks, Marvin. Adam, Michael, in the last couple of minutes, your thoughts.
Yeah, for sure. I would say one of the trends that I see a lot happening here in the West Coast is giving circles. Like that is something that like people really, really love here. Like, and it gets so niche and so specific. And I'm like, wait, there's a giving circle for that? Like, like that's like I'm so glad that those 10 people found each other, right? Like, and I think it's all about building community. And like I think the what I would say is that West Coast giving is very communal. It's very like people talk about it, but they don't talk about it in a way that's like showy or ostentatious. It's like, no, like, hey, do you know that this about this organization? Like, do you know like the impact that they're making? And so that's where I think those giving circles are really becoming powerful, particularly in Northern California. Like if you're based like in the West Coast and you like have a very niche kind of topic or specific kind of task, I would start searching and thinking if there's giving circles that are doing like supportive work, because they probably are. And then I think to Marvin's point, like one of the things that's kind of showing up, I think more on the West Coast is like this idea, kind of what you're talking about, but a little different. And that there's a lot of conversations around public-private partnerships. So like, what is it that the government is doing to be supportive at the same time as foundations and individuals? And I think that comes from the fact that so many of our leaders in the like government, like the federal government, come from San Francisco, right? Like, I mean, it's pretty, I mean, we have like the vice president, the like current speaker of the house, and like one of the oldest sitting senators, right? And they're all based, I mean, San Francisco is just like such a hub of politics. And I think people forget about that we're like paving, like San Francisco and Northern California are always steps ahead, right? Like Speaker Pelosi, when she was elected, was the first person to stand on the floor of the House of Representatives and say, you know, I'm Representative Pelosi, I'm from San Francisco, and I'm here to fight AIDS. Like that was groundbreaking at the time. And so the fact that like we're always kind of ahead of the game, I would say, in like terms of social justice, and we're always pushing that needle, like that then and our access to our government officials, like, you know, I mean, I talk to people all the time, like we have a really strong partnership with the speaker's office. And I'm like, oh, you know, I like know their chief of staff personally. And when I say that in DC or New York, people kind of take a step back and they're like, whoa, like, you know, like the chief of staff. I'm like, yeah, like there's less than 1 million people that live in San Francisco. Like our adjacency to like these folks is not as great as it is in other places. And because of that, I think we expect more from our elected officials. And so there's constantly this push of like, how can we leverage state funds or federal funds to make bigger impacts of partnership? And then how do we do all that together? And I see that showing up more and more. I get questions of like, it's not questions about what kind of government funding do you get, but it's how can my gift help leverage government funding.
That was so astute, and this has exceeded all expectations I've had. This has been so interesting. So thank you so much to both of you. If folks wanted to get in touch with you, is it okay if I put your LinkedIn profiles in the show notes? Adam, Michael,
Perfect.
Marvin, thank you so
Absolutely.
much. And Adam, Michael, I got to say, you make West Coast fundraising seem a lot easier. Marvin, you might want to move to the West Coast.
I know. I've been having second thoughts this entire conversation.
I know. You could just text people for money. All
It's
right.
a lot of texting though, and a lot of messages on your phone. I don't know if that's really the direction you want to go either.
I don't know. Marvin's like answering midnight calls from donors, so this might be better for him. Gentlemen, thank you so much for this. It's been so fun. Thanks to everyone, and happy holidays. Enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.